Next on GPS, the UN Human Rights Chief is stepping down. Why? Because it seems so few of the world's most powerful nations care about human rights anymore. He will tell us the story when we come back. A warning to our viewers, you are about to see some graphic images. This week, the world finally paid attention again to human rights in Syria, but only after ghastly images spread swiftly around the globe. Videos of sick children, some seemingly dying, others desperately gasping for air. But global opinion is one thing, great power politics another. Less than a month ago, the UN Security Council was supposed to hear a report on the human rights situation in Syria. The person who was to brief the council was Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, the UN's High Commissioner on Human Rights. I asked him to explain what happened at that March 19th UN Security Council meeting and why it is symbolic of the reason he is quitting his important job.
Fareed, I was invited to brief the Security Council on Syria, and there was a procedural motion introduced by Russia. I needed 9 votes of the 15 members of the Security Council to provide the briefing, and I only secured 8 votes.
So they wouldn't even hear you?
They wouldn't hear me speak about human rights violations in Syria. I mean, it's almost an absurdity. What else would you talk about in the Security Council if it were not for the severe violations? And it was clear to me that were I to signal my intention to continue, the procedure in the UN is that the permanent 5 of the Security Council, so Russia, China, US, France, and the UK, would, and this is tradition, would have to agree. And it was just inconceivable that they would agree unless I compromised. And the office I lead is outspoken. We do also conduct quiet diplomacy, and we do technical support, but we've made our mark as an outspoken office. And in this current environment, you could only be that. And if I were to continue, it would have involved compromise, and I was not willing to do that.
You also point out that France has itself been willing to use its veto and use its power to sometimes act against human rights.
Well, I mean, the problems we've had most recently is with these horrific terrorist attacks and these movements that have spread across the world. It's impelled governments to react, but so heavy-handed have the reactions been that it's quite obvious to us that in some cases, as Nietzsche once said, when fighting the monster, be careful not to become one yourself, that governments themselves have been violating the rights of their peoples in defense of them. And it's a very absurd sort of position to take. And so you see massive denials of, the right to privacy, the freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, and all on the back of a narrative of fighting terrorism. In the end, terrorists can create great harm, but it's only governments that will break this world, as we all know all too well.
And I think there's been a tendency to believe that with all these things, the trends were moving in the right direction. Yes, there were bad things happening in China, there were bad things happening in Russia, but the trend line was in the right direction. But then I look at a place like China or Turkey, which you have again been outspoken on. And it seems as though in Turkey, certainly, things are going very much in the wrong direction.
Yes, it's hard to defend a position when the arrests have been so large-scale and the mantra of accusing everyone of being affiliated to a terrorist movement or a terrorist group being applied to clearly liberal, let's say, media outlets. And when, at the time, half the journalists imprisoned around the world were in Turkey, it's hard to explain it other than a growing repression, a growing movement to repress and stifle freedom of expression and peaceful assembly and the like. So we see this growing authoritarianism. And with it, the world will become increasingly unstable, because with it, you also have a repudiation and a rejection of the very laws that have been constructed to keep this globe somewhat stable and safe.
Up next, Is America, the country that set up the current international human rights system, now abandoning its legacy? Yes, says UN Human Rights Chief Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein. Indeed, he says, the U.S. record on human rights is only getting worse. Back now with more of my interview with the soon-to-be former UN Human Rights Chief, Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein. He says that less than a month ago, the UN Security Council refused to even let him give the Council a briefing on human rights problems in Syria. It is just one example, he says, of how the world is turning its back on human rights, which has led him to leave his important position. Let me ask you about another important country, perhaps the most important country. You said that you feared that the United States, for the first time since 1946, from the founding of the United Nations and this whole system, that the United States was now backing away from the promotion of human rights internationally.
Again, looking at this vote in the Security Council, I think years ago would have been unimaginable that we couldn't brief on Syria.
But you think that in the past the U.S. would have very forcefully insisted that the UN Human Rights Commission...
I think so. I served on the UN Security Council a few years ago, and I think that would have been the case. But in overall terms, at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, there is no U.S. ambassador that's been appointed, which is rather sort of stark, and you sense the absence. And the feeling is that, yes, there's certain issues which either the president has spoken about, whether we go back to the executive orders at the beginning of his presidency, or since then, of course, we have the whole...
the travel bans. The
travel bans. And, of course, the issue of the Dreamers and the DACA, and how we are in a sort of almost in a state of limbo. And then the various comments that the president has made in respect of race, in respect of gender, Charlottesville, Arpaio, all these issues, and the attacks on journalists. And we were extremely concerned because not only is it out of sync with what the historical experience has been, at least since the Second World War, for U.S. governments, but also it provides an example for others to mimic what the U.S. has been saying and doing.
You've also been tough on Arab countries.
Yes.
Have you been chastised by the government of Jordan? Are you finding, I think people have always assumed, these human rights commissioners, you don't criticize your own. Do Arabs regard this as a betrayal? I mean, everything you've said, of course, is true, but it's been tough on your own part of the world.
Well, the relationship I have with my own country, I mean, emotionally, it's a country that I love a great deal and I have a great deal of devotion for. But professionally, I do not distinguish it from any other country. And if we believe there are positive developments, we will cite them. And there have been a few in respect of the human rights of women. If there are negative developments, we will also speak about these negative developments. But I think any more objective examination of the record will bear out that we've tried to be, and my office tries to be, as fair as we can possibly be. It's one of the small sacrifices that one has to make, unfortunately, when one has this sort of position, that you will lose the support of those who want you to be partisan, and you simply cannot in this position.
Does that mean it, given how much of an equal opportunity offender you have been, does this make it difficult for you for your next step? I mean, I can't imagine some of these countries are going to support your, a higher position in the international system or something like that?
In the end, Fareed, it's when you see human rights defenders, usually journalists and lawyers around the world, who are willing to forfeit everything, a chance to be with their families, to be with their friends, knowing that if they publish a piece, if they report on a corruption story, or if they speak out about abuse of authority, that's going to land them in jail, maybe even be tortured, possibly never see their families again, and yet they still do it. And it's a courage of a sort that normal people are not used to seeing. And we see a great deal of it. And that inspires many of us to be more courageous. It's not easy to speak out constantly about these issues, but you do it because the victims need you to do it. And the other human rights defenders, who are the real heroes in this confrontation of ideas, because they're willing to risk their lives, they inspire us. And so, in the end, it's a no-brainer. You end up you do it because it's the right thing.
Pleasure to have you on, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Fareed.
Next on GPS, where does America rank amongst the world's nations on political empowerment for women? Near the top, the middle, or the bottom? We'll tell you when we come back.